Good afternoon, everybody. I see everyone filing in, so I think we can start. It's really my pleasure to welcome you to this short webinar where we're going to analyse what happened in 2023 in the corporate power purchase agreement market. For anyone who's not familiar with the resource platform, we're a coalition of corporate energy buyers and suppliers. Our mission is simply to make it easier for corporates to procure more renewable energy by improving the regulatory environment, holding events and workshops, and developing tools for corporate buyers. So thanks for joining us today. On the next slide, before we get started, I'll just introduce the team that we've got lined up for you today. My name is Annie Scanlon, and I'm Policy and Impact Director of the Resource Platform. We also have Guy Brindley of Wind Europe, who's Head of Market Intelligence, and Simon Dupont, who's a Policy Analyst for Markets and Investments at Solar Power Europe. So the big announcement: how many gigawatts of contracted corporate PPA capacity was finalized in 2023? There we have it, a whopping 10.4 gigawatts. This really was a record year for corporate PPAs. You can see that the new capacity has mainly been driven by solar, but wind is obviously growing as well too. That dark green that you see there at the bottom is the renewables portfolio. So this is experiencing year-on-year growth because corporates are seeing the attractive offer that the complementarity of wind and solar can have if you procure together. So that's clearly a growing trend as well. So really great results. It's a very exciting time for PPAs. So for the rest of this webinar, we're going to dig a bit more in detail at what the results say. So on the next slide, we can see the market perspective. Spain continues to come out on top. So in 2023, PPAs in Spain added almost 3 gigawatts to the energy system. Second top last year was Germany with just over 2 gigawatts of new capacity. And then we saw good growth in other countries as well, like France, United Kingdom, and Sweden. On the next slide, you can see how this is reflected in the all-time perspective. So looking ahead, Germany looks like it's poised to challenge Spain for the title of the most active PPA market. Looking a bit closer in Germany on the next slide, you can see this year-on-year growth, and clearly it's taken off in 2023. That little drop that you see in 2022, this was actually seen across Europe. It's not exclusive to Germany. And this was really caused around the uncertainty of prices with the market volatility we saw, which was caused by the war in Ukraine. But clearly a strong bounce back in 2023. You can see there's quite a nice spread of solar and wind. And as I said, a very impressive contracted over 2 gigawatts of capacity. And this came from 30 PPA deals. So Germany, one to watch, I think. On the next slide, we're just going to zoom in on Spain. Spain continues to be the best in class in Europe. You can see that similar drop in 2022, but in 2023, it's come back strong, particularly strong solar year. Guy later will go in a bit more detail of how this picture reflects the electricity generated, but that's the capacity you see reflected there in 2023. This came from 31 PPAs, so on par with what happened in Germany. And we saw particularly really big solar agreements. For instance, there was a 469 megawatt solar PPA signed in Spain, which is huge, but really, really excellent news. So that was Spain. Continues to be a great market aside of PPA. If we look at the next slide, we can see how the individual sectors are performing. So this is a nice year-on-year analysis of the sectors. Apologies, we have messed up the color a little bit. So it's actually there'll be differences in the colors, but you'll work it out. But this shows a growth of the indication of what's to come. So just to zoom in on a few of the highlights. In 1 year, the automotive sector, for example, is up 50% of their all-time contracted capacity. Food and drinks is up around 90%, and retail has more than doubled its capacity in 1 year. So this is very exciting, and you can see that interest from lots of different companies. On the next slide, we've got the all-time perspective. So the top industries continue to be big tech and heavy industry. ICT sectors, that's the big tech companies. Heavy industry, it's sectors like chemicals, metals production. So clearly they're still very much in the lead. But the growth of other sectors really shows that PPAs are becoming a much more attractive option for corporates. And this is really great news for the renewables rollout and for corporates' decarbonisation strategies. That other sectors you see at the end, by the way, is just the rest of the sectors grouped, and this captures sectors like pharmaceuticals, logistics, and the public sector. On my final slide, let's just have a little look at the top energy buyers. Really nice mix here of big tech, aluminium, steel, chemicals, telecoms, food companies. So that's great. Again, showing the spread of interest in PPAs. Clearly, we've got to shout out Amazon. Good job, guys, over there in your procurement team. But clearly, all of these companies are very active in the PPA market, and it's great to see. So over to Guy now. Can you tell us a bit more about what's happening from a wind energy perspective, and if there's anything else you noticed interesting in 2023?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Annie. Good afternoon, everyone. My pleasure to be here. This is the chart showing the contracted capacities. This is the same as Annie's first chart, really. And maybe I'll just talk about that a little in a little bit more detail. There's a few things to pick up. Clearly, solar has really taken off in the last few years, and that's really driven a lot of growth. Wind has seen steady increase in these contract capacities. I understand there's a question regarding what these renewables portfolios represent. So these are PPAs signed with a portfolio of renewable assets, essentially. So a big utility which has solar, wind, and often hydro will sign a PPA. It's not it benefits from the fact that a corporate can sign this, and it doesn't have to be the whole term of the asset. So it can be less than 10 years, sometimes 7 years. It gives the utility price stability over that period of time, which is useful for them and allows them to invest in more assets. So it's a bit of a hybrid. We still count that as a PPA, even though it doesn't have a direct link to one specific asset. So you can see that those are becoming more popular. And I think that is also reflected in the fact that we're getting many more of those sectors that Annie was talking about before. One of the big limitations for corporates to sign long-term PPAs is credit risk. So they have to be able to demonstrate creditworthiness to banks to make the PPA bankable. So by starting to have these renewables PPAs allows more corporates and slightly smaller corporates to get involved in green energy procurement. The other trend you can see here is offshore wind. I'll go a bit more into that in the next couple of slides. But first, the other interesting thing I wanted to show, also I want to look from a wind perspective, but we talk about capacity the whole time, and I wanted to try and understand what does that really mean? You know, we're contracted over 10 gigawatts of capacity. Well, perhaps there's a way of comparing it, and I thought a good way to do that would be to look at what this gigawatts of capacity translate into energy. So in the next slide, if we could go there, please, I've taken a look at the amount of energy contracted in these renewable PPAs. Obviously, the trends are very similar because we're looking at similar things. Wind has a higher capacity factor. So essentially, there's more electricity produced per gigawatt in wind. But you can see there's a nice balance, and we're at the resource platform technology neutral. We want solar, wind, and any type of renewable PPA. On the next slide, oh, actually, before I go, sorry, yes, I had a couple of other things to mention. Firstly, the amount of contracted capacity amount of contracted energy, you can see is around about 23 terawatts. So that is quite easily comparable. So that amount of electricity would cover the electricity demand of both Lithuania and Estonia. So it is a huge amount that we're seeing in this record year. And if you look at the total amounts contracted over the whole period in this chart, which is, there are a couple more, but they're probably immaterial to this. The amount of electricity is over 85 terawatt hours, which would be enough to cover the demand of a country like Belgium. So this is the sort of sizes of contracted renewable electricity we're talking about. It's very impressive. Okay, now, thank you. If we could go to the next slide. So this is the picture for wind on its own. I could have shown this by capacity, very similar trends. I've mentioned that wind is picking up a lot. In general, it's picking up, but offshore really is taking off in the last few years. In 2023, there were 23 PPAs for offshore wind for 1.5 gigawatts. These were all in Germany, Netherlands, and there was one in the UK as well. But interestingly, already in 2024, we've had some really enormous PPAs being signed. So 473 and 478 megawatts by Amazon in the UK and Google in the Netherlands, respectively. So already pushing on 1 gigawatt signed just in January of this year. On the onshore side, there were 50 deals, and that totals around about 1.9 gigawatts. A couple of interesting ones that I wanted to pick out. So Les Mousquetaires, a retail group in France, signed a PPA for a wind farm which has been repowered, and there are 2 PPAs signed for a wind farm in Ireland. That's Slane Irish Whiskey and Valeo Foods. And this is also for a repowered wind farm. And I think this is an interesting development. So repowering is when you remove the old turbines and replace them with much more efficient, usually a lot larger turbines, because the first turbines were put in the best wind areas. But if it's a long time ago, the technology's moved on a lot. So you can get a lot more power from a repowered wind farm. We think this is going to be a trend going forward, and these are the first examples of PPAs that I've seen for repowered wind farms. So with that, I will hand over to Simon to give us the solar perspective.
Thank you very much, Guy, and congrats for this amazing PPA year. For wind, now I would like to drive you a little bit into the figures for solar. We have a record year for solar PPAs. As you can see on the screen, 6.1 gigawatts signed for solar CPPAs this year. It's more than last year, as you can see, as we had 2.7 gigawatts signed last year. So this year, who is dominating the market? We had a lot of PPAs in Spain, with honorable mentions for France, Poland, Germany, Bulgaria, and also Ireland, who all managed to sign either a large number of deals or either large capacities. So on the next slide, maybe we can focus more on a comparison that I wanted to show you between last year and this year, especially with regards to contracted capacities. So as you can see, last year we were at 7.1 gigawatts signed for corporate PPAs with solar energy, and this year we reached 13.2 gigawatts. So we almost doubled our all-time CPPA contracted capacity. So this amazing year is also reflecting the link that is starting to be, that we are starting to have between the constructed capacities that were also at record figures for this year and the PPA capacities. So for 2023. Now on the next slides, I really wanted to talk to you about some nice PPA stories from this year that I think are reflecting perfectly the new trends that we are seeing on the PPA market in Europe. The first one is a PPA signed between the Fashion Pact and Lightsource BP. The Fashion Pact is a consortium of fashion brands, and among these fashion brands, 12 of them signed what we call a multi-buyer PPA, which is a collective PPA. In this consortium of fashion brands, we have brands that you know, that you heard of, such as Prada, Ralph Lauren, or Under Armour. This is the biggest PPA in the textile industry. And so, of course, it shows that multi-buyer PPAs are a very nice way of reuniting the objective of several companies that are willing to decarbonize by aggregating their electricity demands so they can sign PPAs with developers. Second story that I wanted to share with you today about PPA signed last year in 2023. It's a PPA between agro-foods industrial Bonduelle and the independent power producer in France, Arcolia. So they signed a 10.5 megawatts PPA in the southwest of France. But what's really interesting about this PPA is that it was the first one using the public guarantee scheme that was released in France last year in September. So PPA guarantee schemes were promoted heavily in the last market design revision because they have the opportunity, they present the opportunity to de-risk investments and de-risk the off-taker risk. So the idea is that more off-takers can sign PPAs thanks to the guarantee schemes, and we are seeing more countries such as Spain, for example, who also released a guarantee scheme at national level. So those are two trends. And the last one, but not the least, trend that I wanted to share with you is a PPA that was signed between Carlsberg and Green Genius in Lithuania. So why this PPA is original? Because it's actually a PV plus storage PPA with, at the same time, a utility scale projects PV plants and on-site rooftop PV that will supply the electricity to Carlsberg Brewery. And this is a battery system was also included in the contract. So that's a trend that we're seeing as increasing in the next years, and it enables to have a consumption profile of any supplier to be fulfilled by the possibility of PPAs, the opportunity of PPAs. So yeah, that's it for the three nice stories and the sort of figures that I wanted to share with you today. And now I will hand over to Annie for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Super. Well, stay visible, Simon, because we might have some questions for you. And I'd also ask Guy to switch his camera back on because there's been lots of questions in the chat, which is great. Everybody is listening and has questions. First question, maybe for Guy. Yeah, about the kind of time range and average length of signed PPAs. Are we seeing something different in 2023 compared to the past?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I literally just looked into it, which is why I didn't turn my camera on straight away. Essentially, we're not seeing much different in 2023 compared with the previous years, and the numbers are basically this. They're not basically this, they are this. In 2023, the average duration of PPAs for new assets was around 13.5 years. Overall time for new assets, it was around 13.3, so not really a significant difference there. For all, this includes lifetime extensions, so some of them are a bit shorter. You've got 5 years maybe. They're both around 12 years when you take that into account. So this is, clearly showing that the majority of the PPAs we are looking at here are for new assets. But there are obviously lots which are less than 13, but I guess these are the averages that I'm picking up.
Super. Maybe one additional one for Guy. It was about how we record VPPAs, so virtual PPAs versus physical PPAs. Is that just collectively all in the data?
Yeah, it's all together. We try and track virtual and physical, and we certainly record it where we know. But to be quite honest with you, lots of this data isn't available, so it's quite hard to see any trends. What we do see is more and more PPAs with announced for virtual. I don't think they were very common at all a few years ago, and we see them more and more. They're more versatile, so they allow you to sign for, say, a distributed load. So if you're a supermarket chain, you have lots of different loads. A virtual PPA can allow you to put those all together and sign it under one contract, or it can allow more easily you contract across borders. So there are advantages to the virtual one.
Super. Loads of questions coming in. Love it. Lots of people asking about the multi-buyer PPA. I mean, we've definitely seen that as a very interesting trend from last year. You know, I think clearly a lot of corporates have woken up to PPAs, but that risk profile clearly is a big barrier. So any way to share that risk is seen as very attractive. On how it works exactly, I feel like that's a topic for another webinar. We will actually be covering this in one of our meetings of the Energy Buyer Hub this year. So if you're an energy buyer, you can tune in. We also did a session at Amsterdam last year, so we can share the recording on that. And I'm sure we'll probably feature it again in Amsterdam this year, just because it's such an interesting option and clearly tackles that problem of how smaller companies can get involved. Just looking at the other questions. Yeah, a nice one about outlook for 2024. I mean, we kind of touched a little bit on that in terms of sort of the key sectors and key trends. You know, I think looking at the analysis of those different sectors, I think the ones to watch are probably consumer goods, manufacturing and retail. I think we can expect a lot of PPAs in those sectors this year. Certainly this multi-buyer trend is going to continue. An interesting angle of that actually is, you know, larger companies looking to mitigate their scope 3 emissions want to sign a multi-buyer PPA with their suppliers. So there was a really interesting one with Thermo Fisher Scientific, who they partnered with Eurofins Scientific, the latter part being part of their supply chain. So it's sort of tackling scope 2 and 3 in the same deal, which is very interesting. In 2023, we also saw first PPAs being signed for green hydrogen, which we all know is going to be critical for heavy industry to decarbonize. So this is only going to grow, I think, this year, particularly with the policy steer we've seen at EU level with the Commission putting emphasis on PPAs to certify green hydrogen. And then one trend Guy picked out on sort of PPAs from repowering wind farms, you know, very interesting for corporates who want that additionality factor. So I think those are kind of the top ones. I don't know, Guy and Simon, if there's any trends or predictions that you can add.
I can add, well, I can't add trends and predictions. That's difficult, of course. But I think you're right. It's clearly you're seeing increase in both demand and supply. We can only expect it to continue to increase. Looks like prices are in a good place. But actually, it's worth noting in your first slides that even though we had this year of energy crisis in 2022 and so much volatility, and we did see some dips in France and Germany and as you say, across Europe, but it was still a pretty successful year for PPAs. And I think that really demonstrates that even in crisis times, or perhaps even more in crisis times, it demonstrates the value of fixing your prices for the long term. Given the prices are back down to those that we saw before the crisis, I'm sure that there is a huge demand for PPAs. And I mean, we've seen almost all countries now sign in Europe sign, or at least almost all in the EU sign PPAs. So yeah, I think it's a positive forecast. I would not like to give you a capacity or energy figure, but I'm going to say more than 10 gigawatts for 2024.
We'll revisit that in the 2025 webinar. See if you were right. Nice question about the view of the primary providers. So we showed sort of the top companies that are the corporate off-takers. I mean, Guy, I think we can pull out that top list. We'll probably have to check with the suppliers if they're happy with that. But in theory, we do have that data. So maybe we'll add that to the website. How many projects have storage? I mean, Simon, you mentioned one. Is that the only one we know of? You know, I'm guessing this is going to be a bit of a growing area.
So yes, indeed, this year the only project with storage that we tracked that signed a PPA was the one in Lithuania, but we obviously see the trend growing as solar plus storage and renewable plus storage projects are also increasing, and as PPAs are tailored instruments, we can see more and more developers proposing that kind of formats to their buyers.
Absolutely. Nice. Okay, we do have some minutes left, so I'm going to carry on with these questions. What are the levers that could still accelerate PPA growth? Very, very good question. I think And Guy and Simon, chip in if you have other ideas, but I think we do see that sort of credit risk bankability as kind of the number one deterrent. And then for other industries like the heavy industry, wanting more kind of baseload PPAs because they've got such high consumption, these still are barriers. I think also then on the business side of things, sort of education, know-how, lots of companies don't have sophisticated procurement teams. That's probably set to change. But particularly at Resource, if companies come to our event, there are some companies starting right at the beginning. And so I think there's a role to play for sort of, sharing that best practice between companies. And I think from the policy perspective, last year we had the reformed electricity market design from EU level, and in the implementation of that at national level, there's a lot for member states to take advantage of. So for instance, that member states should really encourage PPAs. They should put in place guarantee schemes. They should allow combined CFD and PPA projects. But that's all quite high level. So I think a bit of a call to action for this group is to really stay on top of how that's being implemented at national level, sharing the advice from industry of how you can really help corporates, get involved and start signing PPAs, because that's really the spirit and a great signal from policymakers that they see this as a very important tool for the energy transition. Anything else on barriers, Simon, Guy?
I just wanted to answer a question maybe. I saw a question on how the grant scheme could de-risk the PPA offtake. Actually, the idea of the public guarantee scheme, is to provide the PPA revenues to the developer in the case of an off-takers invoice unpayment. So, for example, in France, after 3 unpaid invoices, the developer can activate this guarantee. So it gives a lot more financial certainty for the developer to engage with buyers profiles that they wouldn't engage in normal times. So we see it as a tool with a high potential to open new markets.
Super. Thanks, Simon. And thanks everyone for your questions. There's been a ton of questions, so I think we clearly all need to grab a coffee and catch up about this at another time. But I think in the spirit of finishing on time, so you can all go about your day, I'll just switch up to conclude with a couple of plugs. So next slide, please. And just a quick note that all the data that you've seen today is on the website, so immediately you can go check this all out for yourself. One thing I mentioned earlier was the Resource Energy Buyers Hub. So this is an online forum. We meet about once a quarter. Any corporate energy buyer is welcome to join. It's a great learning forum. We'll have presentations from advanced buyers, from suppliers, and everyone can just ask questions and really accelerate this learning piece that we've been talking about. So you can sign up on our website, and we'll also pop the link into the email you'll all get after this webinar. And then on the next slide, our biggest event is our annual event. We're coming back to Amsterdam, of course. So we really, really encourage you all to join that if you can. For energy buyers, there's lots of opportunities to learn, to meet suppliers, to meet advanced buyers. So that's a really excellent place to do all of that. And then clearly for suppliers, it's a great way to meet corporate off-takers, network, loads of fun networking opportunities. So if you like a laugh, come and join us in Amsterdam, and you might learn a thing or two. So thanks so much. Just going to wrap up now with my contact details. We had a ton of questions. I'm not sure I'll be able to get back to every single one, but if you want to connect with Resource, you want to work with us, please don't hesitate to reach out. Really happy to chat with anyone. And thanks for joining. It's an exciting time for PPAs, as we've seen, and we can just see all of this growing over the course of this year. So looking forward to working with you all. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.